When it comes to year 12, holidays don't actually really exist. You're always gonna have other things that you could be doing to help with you getting the potential ATAR that you want. You're probably behind on a few things, and there's probably a few things that you have to do on these holidays to catch up. And this is the same thing at uni as well, but particularly if you're in year 12, you probably have other priorities like focusing on the UCAT or doing some other assignments or just doing some general study. If you fell behind in term 1, how are you going to make sure for certain that the same thing doesn't happen in term 2 when term 2 is going to be a lot more of a workload as well? Let's make history not repeat itself. Hey guys, Arch here, a second year medical student, and on this channel we focus on learning how to learn so that we can be more intentional with our time, so we can spend it on the things and people that matter to us. If you want to keep up with the pace of year 12, you have to be more than capable to deal with the workload that comes with it. And this doesn't necessarily just mean studying longer and harder. In this video, we're going to be going through pre-study, then we're going to talk about analyzing our results, and to finish it off with the most important thing, how do we reduce the amount of time that we have to revise and beat the forgetting curve? The first thing that I just want to mention is that getting ahead just for the sake of getting ahead is kind of meaningless and useless, because eventually you're going to actually end up being at the same point as everyone else. And let me explain with this. The only possible way to get actually ahead is if you're effective and efficient with the way that you are learning. And this is to the point that you don't rely on a teacher, that you can do self-regulated learning and go at your own sort of pace. But if you do learn mostly in class, this means that if you even do get ahead in your own time, there's going to be something that comes up in class that you're not aware of, and then you'll just fall back to their pace. You'll find that little thing that you can't do, and then you just have to re-engage back in class, and then it's so much harder to get back to where you were. Not only this, if you are rushing content to just get ahead, that's even 10 times worse than just doing it at the same pace as your class. It's much better to learn at the same pace of your class, but to a much deeper level, and that's where you can get a real competitive advantage. So what's the key to learning more deeply? The solution to this is effective pre-study, which you can be doing on your own, and this is more an advanced thing if you do it on your own, but essentially you're giving yourself some structural priming that makes it easier for you to hinge new pieces of information off old information that you already know. And you can also do this in class as well, if you're just trying to formulate how these things interconnect, and you might be doing that through some mind maps as well. So the main key thing here is that we're trying to encode information into our long-term memory a lot earlier in the learning process. This means you're going to be lengthening the forgetting curve, which I'll get into a little bit more later on, but also if you're able to encode this into your long-term memory, then it's available for later on retrieval. I kind of talked about this before, but it's like building a bookshelf and then putting the books on there with the, all the information and concept that you need to learn. You put that on the bookshelf. So it's much better to create that bookshelf before putting books on it. And that's much better than just creating a pile of books stacked on top of each other. And another way that we can sort of think about this is with a house. You're not going to put a roof if there's no foundations for the house yet, right? You need to have the foundations, then you can have the structure, and then you can have the roof on top. So it's really the same when it comes to our learning. If we don't make this structure beforehand, well, then we're just gonna be building our house of knowledge in a very haphazard way, and it's not going to be very stable. You can't really expect to remember a lot of ideas for a long amount of time if you haven't prepared your brain for building connections. If you're aiming for really high grades, I'm assuming that one of the things that you might be dealing with is simple or silly mistakes. Now is the best time to focus on any sort of mistakes that you've made in term 1. So one of the biggest things here is to take a look at your mark test and see particularly what you got wrong. And think deeply about why you got that particular question wrong. And even before this, thinking about why do you get the grade that you got. If you thought you were going to get an A+, but you got an A-, that's really dangerous. That's a bad sign. It means that you're not self-aware enough with your actual competency with that particular topic compared to what your actual competency is. So your level of confidence doesn't match up with your level of ability. Now, what this really means and why I say it's just generally dangerous is that this can definitely happen again on your next test. If we're all about improving ourselves every single point that we can, then we can't let this proceed for any further. So the biggest way that I think about getting over this is by using this thing called the what, why, and how framework. Now, it's quite simple, but generally you want to apply this to any sort of mistakes that you've seen in your work. And what you're thinking about, right, is that you've prepared for this test. You've already put a lot of time aside for it, and you prepared yourself to your best ability, but you still got that particular grade. You still got an A-. So if that's the case, there are some issues with the way that you were actually preparing, and that's what needs to be addressed. Now, if we're looking at this sort of mistakes, this is how we sort of do it. So the first thing to think about is what was the mistake that you made? And you have to think about this quite specifically. It's not that you just misread the question or didn't see that word. There's a particular cognitive reason why you actually misread that word or didn't see it. And most of the time it comes back to a conceptual thing, which is something like you didn't understand the importance of this particular thing. And if it's something as simple as a plus or a minus that you keep missing out on, well, then we can think about like your strategy in how you actually write it down. So for example, let's just get something on here. If you're always forgetting to put a square on things, then a way of getting around that, and this is something that I did when I had this issue, is that I always put brackets around the particular thing that I needed to square, and I made it the 2 really big. Now, once I'd done this enough time, it became a habit, and now whenever I see brackets, my first thought is to look if there is a power on it, and I never miss it now. Now, the why is, why did you make that particular mistake? So a lot of the time people say that they get the units wrong, they forget the units when they're doing things in physics, for example. That means you didn't understand the importance of what units are actually for and why do you need them. Now, that's a very big question, kind of like, you know, what's the meaning of life and this sort of stuff. So you need to find your own reason for that in whatever way that you can by looking at particular resources, as long as you can find a reason for why this is extremely important. And this is beyond superficial meanings as well. You can't just say things like, oh, I need to put units because it's in the marking criteria, you know, because your brain doesn't think that's enough of an important reason to actually remember it for later. So now we're thinking about the real reason that you didn't understand the importance of the word evaluate, because you've done all this preparation, and how did you not see that before? There's something to think about there. And I know that you guys are probably going to be like, oh, well, this is not really specific about what I have to actually do. It's something that you have to make up on your own. It's very, very, very specific to you. But yes, there are better ways of approaching this, and thinking more deeply about this is always better. And the final part is, how do you prevent this mistake from ever happening again? You don't ever want to make the same mistake twice. Pretty much all these 3 steps are so important. This is where you figure out the thing like I just explained with that little square, and how do you prevent this from ever happening again. And the thing about this is you have to be really creative, and because if you're thinking about how do you solve the issue, you need to pinpoint it directly. You can't just say things like, I'm going to study harder, I'm going to study longer, I'm going to do more practice questions. That won't cut it, because guess what? You were probably already doing that beforehand. So it needs to be something very specific and different. I haven't really talked about this before, but this is something I use religiously in year 12. And when I spoke to my other friends who got 99.95 ATARs and around that, they did a similar thing, because it's all about reflection and how do you improve from there. There's no point in just doing another test, forgetting about it, and then just moving on to the next test, because there's so much learning opportunities that are available once you've done a test and see how you were marked. Now, if you also think about the difference between someone who gets like a 99 ATAR versus 99.95, a lot of the time it comes down to these silly mistakes, and these are the hardest mistakes to get rid of, which is why this stops people from getting top marks. So it's a serious issue, and that's why there's a particular method here that's quite systematic in how do you approach it, but no one wants to do this because it's not that fun and it's hard to do, but this is what actually matters. Don't be the next person who just gets stuck in doing thousands of practice questions. This is the thing that matters. Okay, so here's the most important thing, is remembering everything that you've done in term 1 for the future coming up to your exam. The single biggest time waster when it comes to studying is spending all the time to learn and understand something to a required depth, but then a few months later just forgetting all of that and you have to do it again. That's just like the biggest waste of time. And this happens a lot of times as well with all of the tests that you have for a particular subject. Like for maths, for example, I had 6 tests and then I have the exam. Imagine doing that 6 times just for one subject and then doing that for all the other subjects that you have as well. So this is why in year 12, I knew this was going to be a problem. So I made sure that I understood all the content and didn't forget it as soon as doing a test. I know this sounds like common sense, but you need to explicitly think about this so this doesn't insidiously just like become an issue without you realizing it. So here's our forgetting curve. If we think about when we first learned a piece of information, it's going to have a little bit of a dip. Then hopefully you take a look at this information a little bit after with spaced repetition so that you interrupt this forgetting curve. Now you can see that it's actually dropping less and less. Now what we're looking at here is actually 2 repetitions after you first learned it, but ideally for most pieces of information on average, it's at least 5 times that you need to look at something. So the whole point with active recall is that you're going to interrupt this forgetting curve and you space out these recalls. So that's how active recall and spaced repetition come into play with this forgetting curve. So the idea of using other techniques beyond active recall and spaced repetition is that we want to increase the length of this forgetting curve. So if we look at the color in red, if we have better techniques that let us learn and understand something more deeply, then you're actually going to have to go a little bit longer before you have to do your first repetition. Now, once you've done this first repetition and your active recall is using these other techniques as well, well then you're gonna really lengthen that curve. So what we're looking at here is that if you are using more effective techniques above active recall and spaced repetition, you will be on that red line. You will still need to space your repetition, but the main thing that you'll sort of notice is that after the first time seeing the content, you remember it to a better degree. And then after repeating it once, you're gonna, that's gonna be a lot more retention for a lot longer until you need that next repetition. So this just saves you a lot of time, and it actually makes it easy for you to learn other things because you'll be having more background knowledge in your mind at that certain point to hinge new information off and make those connections. So if you leave most of your term one content before the exam, you probably don't even remember it at that point. You would have forgotten the majority of those things, which means you're gonna actually not just like refamiliarize yourself with the content, you're actually gonna have to relearn and re-understand, which is just a huge time waster. So the biggest advantage that you can do for yourself is to do a sort of brain dump of sorts and see everything that you know about a particular topic. And this is something that you need to schedule in within your time in these holidays, because if you don't schedule it in, you're gonna always be focusing on what's more urgent, which means you don't make time for this. And this is, you know, essentially that you're gonna run out of time. And if you're not prioritizing this, well then you just won't do it. And so you won't actually be covering all the information that you actually wanted to cover. So I have this big block of time in my holidays where I do the spaced repetition block. And there's probably a few details that you had in your test that you crammed for, and then straight after the test you've forgotten. So this is a good opportunity to pick up on those. So like I've mentioned in my time management video, this is a very, very important task, but it is not urgent because your exam is way, way, way far away. And I can say for those who schedule this in and don't push it back, they'll be able to see this clear benefit later on. They're gonna have more free time before their exams. They're not gonna feel as stressed because they already remember all the stuff from earlier on in the year. And they're gonna understand the content a lot more deeply and remember it better because they were able to create more of those connections. And not only that, you're gonna be able to apply it to more complex scenarios as well, just because you've just got a better understanding. Instead of spending the majority of your time before an exam, just relearning the content, they'll have the time to further develop that understanding. And that's what I was personally doing in year 12. So just like I mentioned before, if you have more information in your brain from term 1 and you come into term 2 with that knowledge, it'll be easier to learn that term 2 knowledge. It's just like the example I said before. You can't learn algebra before learning how to count as a baby, you know? And you can't do calculus if you don't know algebra well enough either. These things build off each other, and that happens all the time. This is, like I mentioned, the reason why cramming doesn't actually work. And the thing that you'll see is that even though you have this clear benefit of having more time, it's actually quite hard to see that over a long period of time. It's hard to see because in the future, and because that extra time that you're saving spreads out across all this time between now and your exam. But you'll definitely thank me later if you do this. Since it's my holidays as well, I'm gonna be doing a brain dump, and I'm particularly gonna do it within a mind map of trying to recall all of the things that I've learned in this term 1, and then see what I don't know and fix up some of those gaps before going into term 2. It's much better for me to see what I remember and don't remember from my quizzes and assessments and all that sort of stuff now, so I can fix it up earlier rather than later. Just because I know how important it is to do this, because I don't want to go too far in the forgetting curve and forget it, because then I have to spend way too much time re-understanding things. If you've made it this far, I hope you've been using your holidays effectively already, and try out a few of these things, and also keep note of these things as you get into your next term. They're extremely important to ongoing learning. All right, thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.